Welcome, everyone. I'm Rachel Vogel, Vice President of Programs for the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. Thank you for joining us for our conversation with the New York Times National Business Energy correspondent, Clifford Krauss. Today's program will be moderated by Mike Anderson of Cosmos Energy. I'd first like to start off by recognizing today's sponsors, Steve and Jeannie LaSala. We would like to thank you both and also all of our members and corporations that have sponsored a webinar. If you would like to sponsor a webinar, you can email Jim Falk. You can also text to donate to the Council by texting dfwworld to 44321. If you're joining us for the first time, please note that you can submit a question throughout the entire program by using the question and answer box on the bottom of your screen. Today's speaker, Clifford Krauss, is the New York Times National Energy Business Correspondent based in Houston. He was previously the bureau chief of the New York Times Buenos Aires and Toronto bureaus and has reported in recent years from North Africa and the Middle East. In 2016, he shared the Society of Publishers in Asia Award for explanatory reporting. Before coming to the Times in 1990, he was a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and the Edward R. Murray Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He is author of Inside Central America: Its People, Politics, and History. Our moderator today is one of the Council's board members, Mike Anderson. Mike is the Senior Vice President of External Affairs, Government Relations, and Security at Cosmos Energy. He joined the British Diplomatic Service in 1984 and served in Moscow, Geneva, and New York, among other postings. In 2003, he moved into leadership roles in the UK Home Government. He became the first Director General for Climate Change in the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and then in the Department of Energy and Climate Change from 2007 to 2009. Thank you for joining us from London, Mike. We appreciate your time, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, and welcome to Clifford. Good to see you virtually. I'm stuck here in London because I can't get back through the borders. You're in Houston, and everyone else on this webinar, I hope, is spread around Texas and other places. It's a great pleasure for me to see you personally. You are a must-read for those of us in the industry, both with your experience and your knowledge over the years. I wanted to start really with a slightly personal question before we move into the geopolitics and into what it means for the US, what it means for Texas, what it means for the individuals on the ground. Precisely because of your history, Clifford, you I've seen a lot. You've reported and spoken about, written about the Yom Kippur War, rise of OPEC at the time, recession of 2008, rise of energy dominance, much, much more, downturns, upturns, economic, social impact globally in Texas. So before we talk though about the current crisis and the price of oil, I'd actually quite like to know what it feels like to be an energy correspondent today in this particular scenario and circumstances. It's your job to try and explain to us what's going on. There's a huge thirst for knowledge in the world today amongst all of us, and there's an enormous volatility. So you have a very particular responsibility. How does that actually feel in today's world, Clifford, would be my first question.
Well, thanks for the question, Mike. First of all, let me say I'm very pleased to be with you all, and I want to compliment all of you for participating in a group that seeks to project and share knowledge on foreign affairs, so important for the public to be involved. Mike, that's a big question. We could spend the whole hour on it, but let me try to be brief. So I've been on this beat now for 14 years. And it's always it's never boring, it always changes. When I first got on the beat, the United States seemed to be running out of oil and natural gas, or at least our production was in decline. And there were all kinds of concerns about importing gas. There was a lot of thinking about peak oil, and everything has changed. In fact, everything has changed about 2 or 3 times since I've been on this beat in the last 14 years. Suddenly, the United States is a major exporter. Most months in the last year or so, we were number 1 in the world, which was a complete turnaround It's been a big change in our foreign policy. Natural gas, the same. What it feels like now is very odd because what we're witnessing is a strain on demand, first of all, but also supply. Suddenly, the country is going in reverse, or at least stalling out when it comes to production. Prices come down, and we're really at a tipping point. It's a very challenging time to be reporting.
And when we talk about where we are today, then Clifford, you're right to say it's challenging, and there's so many areas that we could talk about. I think a way to start the conversation, and when people start coming in with their questions, it can be on the whole range of things you've just raised there. I think one of the questions that we might like to hear from you is, in that historical context, how do we get here today? How do we get to the place that you just described? We're now in a period of 30%, maybe more, demand destruction. We've got OPEC struggling to decide on its policy. We've got President Trump, the US administration, trying to work out how, when, whether to intervene. How would you position that in the context of the history over the years that you've seen? How did we actually get here? How serious do you see it against that backdrop? And in a moment, I might ask you how it's going to play out. But I think, first of all, let's talk about the historical context and the way that you see it, because trying to give it the context is what people have struggled with, I think, in the last few months.
Yeah. Well, it's almost like we're out of context. It's a reversal of so many issues that we've had, and what I mean by that is first of all, like I said, when I came on the beat, but really going back all the way to the 1970s, it's been a matter of securing supply at a reasonable price, keep the economy going, to keep our country secure and safe. When we didn't have secure supplies, we had massive inflation. Going back to the 1970s, the country was really in a bad place right after the Vietnam War, and suddenly we didn't have the country that just a few decades before, during World War II, when we were supplying all of the Allies with fuel, we were virtually on our knees, and we didn't know exactly what to do. There were people that were even talking about, occupying oil fields in the Middle East, and of course we did eventually go to war. And then just in the last few years, with more than doubling of U.S. supplies and a sudden, if not independence, certainly a lesser dependence on oil from other countries, we were in a much more secure position. Now suddenly we have this pandemic, which of course is a body blow to our economy, not just the energy economy. For Texas, of course, it's a double body blow. And the problem is not supply. The problem is, because of the decline in demand around the world and the decline of the price of oil, the United States is suffering from this because now we're a major producer, and the major producing states, principally Texas, suffers from a problem that would have been considered to be a gift from the heavens 30, 40 years ago. Cheap oil, at least for the national economy at that particular time. I'm talking about the 1970s. Of course, when we had a couple of crashes, it wasn't so great for Texas. As people who were here in the 1980s know much better than I do. But so it's hard to sort out for where we're going. That is a very, very tough question, because even just in the past week, we have seen a reversal of a reversal. What I mean by that is you just had, several weeks ago, at least for a short amount of time, a negative oil price, which of course was a technicality. It had to do with the futures markets and a rollover. But all the same, people were talking about an oil price of $5, $10, $15. And suddenly we went to 30 and then 35 and we were approaching 40. And in the last week, we've come down quite a bit to the mid 30s for WTI right now. I think last time I looked, it was $36 a barrel. Certainly an improvement. People who I were talking to, some friends of mine in Oklahoma who were shutting in their wells, I'm talking about small producers now, who are shutting in their wells just a few weeks ago, have turned the taps back on. Now, what they're going to do in the next few weeks, I do not know. So it is a very, very uncertain situation. I do not see a rapid reversal in U.S. production. I think we're going to have lower prices, not necessarily lower than right now, but we're going to have low prices for a long time. And we're going to have an industry, and a lot of the people who are listening to this know this personally, an industry that is going to go through a consolidation. It's going to be more and more dependent on technology, new technology. And of course, this started in 2015, 2016. This is almost a continuation of that trend of lower prices. The $147 a barrel oil, which we had a decade ago, is now a distant memory. So it's a very uncertain time for the industry. I think the industry is going to change, but the industry has shown itself to be extremely adaptable in the past, and I think it will adapt, including to many of the environmental concerns. It will have to adapt, not just because of the environmental movement, but because of the investment environment and what investors demand.
I mean, let's come back to that in a minute, Clifford. I think that's an important subject. I'd just like to refer to one of the things that you were talking in your explanation there. And we really see that once the US got to quite a strong position, energy dominance or energy semi-independence, depending on how you look at it, this has not really gone down well with OPEC, not particularly gone down well with Russia. Do you see it as a policy where Saudi and Russia in particular, but any alliance of the ones that might want to see the US struggling, do you see them continuing to keep that pressure to try and drive down the price to put out of business essentially the shale operators in the US, or do you see it stabilizing because global economic recovery is actually going to be a mutual game in the end? Otherwise, we're all going to suffer. Where do you see that coming out, Clifford?
Well, I would say, first of all, let me just go back just a little bit. If you'll recall, it was Thanksgiving time, 2014, when OPEC, this is before the Saudis and the Russians made this alliance of sorts, OPEC tried to crush shale and the Canadian oil sands. They did a pretty good job with Canada. They certainly slowed Canada down. And but the shale producers proved to be extremely flexible and adept, so that the OPEC people thought that with an oil price of under $60 or $70, that basically shale would disappear. And it turns out that there was still plenty of capital that would go into shale, and there were plenty of producers who were producing, not necessarily making a lot of money, but the strength of shale, and the majors have recognized it, is that you can turn it on and turn it off pretty rapidly. And that kind of flexibility is enormously powerful in a situation like this. So OPEC basically failed. They did not, as a matter of fact, they lost market share at the end of the day, which is rather remarkable. That basically, because of the Permian, U.S. production, after a decline for a few months, was a decline, we took off again. And it was remarkable. A lot of people lost their jobs, of course, and not all of those jobs have come back. companies themselves, depth, the industry changed, did well, and now they tried it again. I mean, OPEC Plus, but basically it's Saudi Arabia and the Russians who came together. And that alliance turned out to be a very uneasy alliance. And so now the world market basically is controlled, maybe controlled is a strong word, but influenced by three powers: Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. And we saw how, President Trump got involved diplomatically, sort of like did a favor for Mexico, and Mexico didn't want OPEC Plus. And in the end of the day, made promises. Promises I'm not sure the president could actually keep, but people were willing to accept basically a fig leaf there. And so the United States went along with cuts, and Russia and Saudi Arabia made amends. But where that alliance is going to go in the future, I'm not so sure it's so firm. Even within Russia, Rosneft always seems to want to produce more, and so they have their own strategy. Putin, who at the end of the day is in control, he looks at things from geopolitics, and so they're a bit divided. And who knows what's going to happen in Saudi Arabia? I mean, the crown prince, how strong is his control? He seems, frankly, to be erratic at times. He's bold, but he's also young. Those two things seem to go together.
And you have a president who's also bold, I think, Clifford, although not quite so young as the Saudi leader.
Maybe young at heart. Maybe young at heart.
He certainly behaves at times, if he is. Do you think the US has made the right response to that pressure? Where we see it as a company, we see actually a tension between his free market philosophy that sits within him. That what you've said, the industry in the US will always come back. There may be, unfortunately, job cuts and problems to start with, but the US has this great capacity to innovate and come back. And partly doesn't want to intervene on the behalf of the oil and gas companies. I can understand that. Equally, he doesn't want countries to play games with the US, and therefore there's some saber rattling and threats that go along with that. How do you think he's played that so far, and what are the options for the US in the future if that game continues?
Well, I look at it a little differently. I think that the president certainly played a role publicly, but I think at the end of the day, what the Russians and the Saudis don't quite understand is that our oil industry is not run by the United States government. It's not like the United States government is the Texas Railroad Commission of old. And we have a marketplace. And so all of these executives are responding to prices and demand. And that's the way the American capitalist system works. And so at the end of the day, American companies responded quickly, but not, and almost uniformly, but not in a truly coordinated fashion the way, say, OPEC does. We don't have, I don't believe, although some people in the public may think this, or at least they used to think this, that these executives get together and they decide what they're going to do. There are, of course, dozens of important companies, oil companies in the United States. And in fact, there are thousands of producers. So I don't think it's President Trump. I think he certainly played a very public role, but at the end of the day, he made promises that the oil companies basically followed through on, but not because those promises were made by him. And I'm referring to cuts in U.S. production. I don't think ExxonMobil and Chevron and ConocoPhillips and all the others are cutting CapEx because they got a phone call from the White House. In fact, I'm sure of that.
No, I don't think any of us are in the industry. I think we're doing it because we're trying to survive, to be perfectly honest.
Exactly.
And although we sort of, in a sense, we know we need to follow that. We know that if there is oversupply, we've got a problem. So I suppose we're trying to play it both ways. Somebody's come in, actually, Clifford, on a question related to that about, which takes you to the other great geopolitical game on talking about, from Bob H., when will we see a threat to the petrodollar in the sense of geopolitics and the petrodollar, and that China's the largest buyer of OPEC plus. And the US now have sanctions, trade tensions with many in OPEC plus. So the China-US element of that, which Bob H. is asking about, how do you see that and the threat to the petrodollar in that sense?
That is a fascinating question, and I'd love to do this again in about a year. We can see how this plays out. I'm glad that we're talking about China for a moment, because China is a huge role now as for its demand as a consumer of oil. And I don't think executives who are listening to this are going to want to hear this, although they probably know it. And that is a big part of the demand that's come back has been China. And China basically very smartly buying up a lot of cheap oil, which they tend to do. So they've been very opportunistic. They bought up a lot of oil, and that, of course, will depress prices later on, because they have all of this cheap oil, and they're going to use that before they're going to buy fresh oil at a higher price. But I think I feel like there was almost a suggestion there in the question about what will be some of the geopolitical fallout around the world from these lower prices. And of course, that is a matter of conjecture at this point. But when you think of who are the producers of oil in the world, they're very important. Many of them are very important countries whose stability is very critical. And I'm speaking in terms of Russia, Saudi Arabia, in fact, all of the Gulf states, Iran, Venezuela, Nigeria, and on and on. And these are countries, some are better positioned than others, but a prolonged period of low oil prices will hurt them very, very significantly. On Saudi Arabia and the Crown Prince's 30-30 plan, where is the money going to come from? The share price of Saudi Aramco after the IPO went up. I haven't looked at the price recently, but it came right back down with the oil price. And a lot of members of the Saudi, because it is not a lot of people around the world bought those shares. It's mostly Saudis themselves who bought those shares. They're hurt. Saudi Arabia is getting to be more in debt, has to cut back social services. How long can they do that without there being tensions within the royal family is a matter of I can't give you an answer to that. But it's serious, and what it will mean for the United States, and is it a good thing for the United States or a bad thing for the United States? We'll see. We'll have to see how it plays out. A weaker Russia, I don't think, is a bad thing.
I think, and someone's just come in actually with another question related to the US reaction to that, Clifford, on the percentage of US GDP is what percentage is US GDP as the capex from energy companies. In the past, it was 30 to 40%, according to our questioner. And I think it relates to the what type of recovery, what type of energy approach do you see the US taking in that world? You answered the question on what percentage of our GDP. I don't know the answer to that. It's capex from energy companies, but then take it perhaps into how does that play out against the original dominance of big energy companies, super majors, and the Permian? How's that going to play out in the future economy?
Well, I can't give you a number on that either. I'm not sure how important that number will be. I can tell you that the percentage of capex of the market value of public companies has been reduced to a fraction of what it once was relative to the entire stock market. I mean, ExxonMobil, Chevron were dominant companies, and they've been replaced by the Amazons and Apples of the world. But I mean, energy is such a critical part of the American economy, and that has so many dimensions to it. It has to do with our prices. It has to do with inflation. I mean, parts of the American economy benefit from low oil prices, and other parts of the economy, like Texas, do better when the price is a bit higher. So we sort of have a hedge now, right? It used to be a one-way street, at least in the 1970s and maybe 80s, with the exception of Texas. And in the 90s, low oil prices at different times seem to help the economy. High oil prices seem frequently precede recessions. So I mean, an oil price, if we could have an oil price in the 50s, maybe, it would be a Goldilocks situation. But obviously, it works. It's a complex equation, but it's not good if the oil price is too low. And frequently, the oil price is low in concert with a recession and deflation, and nobody needs that.
No, we feel it ourselves, just to put in a personal point, I suppose, this week, Clifford, because we went up about 50% from Monday to Wednesday and down about 50% from Wednesday to Friday on our share price and overall value. It makes it very difficult for companies to plan, be logical about how they have a strategic vision on where to go and how they ensure US energy independence in that, how you actually invest money is one of the hardest choices we've got at the minute. What you invested in. There's a series of questions.
It's good if you're a trader, but it's not good if you're a planner, right? But that's the industry is accustomed. It's a commodity industry. All of the executives who have a little gray in their hair have seen these situations before. Not everyone is the same, of course. Each one is slightly different. But it's not an industry that is a straight line. That's for sure. Everybody who's listening in knows that.
I've got one more from Grace Birch, a question in relation to this subject, and then we might move on in a minute into, because a range of questions on green recovery versus brown recovery. Clifford, you'd not be surprised to know. But Grace Birch has come in with an interesting question on whether you think there's more advantages to a company-dominated oil market, which you've been talking about, Exxon, Chevron making the big decisions, rest of us making our decisions, versus a centrally controlled oil market run by national oil companies, I guess, governments. How do you equate the two? Where do you think the advantages lie in the world we're facing?
Well, I guess my bias is in favor of a free market system as opposed to government monopoly. They frequently are corrupt. The American industry is going to change now, and I think some of the weaker players financially are going to have to drop by the wayside. There are going to be mergers. There are going to be takeovers. Companies with strong balance sheets are going to take advantage of that. There's nothing wrong with that. That's part of the capital system. And I think that in the case of shale and the economics of shale, I think that's going to help. That's going to help because I think that there is a strength to the economy of scale when it comes to shale. And so that if you have few companies or fewer companies doing it and focusing on the best rock, you're going to reduce costs and you're not going to be producing shale. You're not going to be producing oil from shale, which is not economic. And that's, I think, where we're going. And I suppose for the industry that could be a good thing. As far as the environment goes, green versus brown, I feel like there are two or three ways of looking at that. First of all, state the obvious, government policy is going to be critical, not just in the United States, but around the world. And I'm speaking in terms of, carbon taxes. A lot of the oil companies have view that as being something that's inevitable down the road. Some of the companies even favor it. And then investment dollars. There seems to be a concern in the investment community, whether this is true or not, that the oil industry is not going to go the way of the tobacco industry, although the tobacco industry survived as well, but that the oil industry basically has a future that's smaller than its past, that way. And that electric cars are going to be more important. Plastics have a lot of issues. So the investment dollars are going other places, investment dollars that might have gone to energy. Now, whether that's going to be true in 2 or 3 years, I don't know. But so those are two things that are important. And the third thing that's important is how energy executives respond to whatever future they perceive. What I find very interesting is you take a look at the European oil companies, and you see this playing out. It seems rapidly at BP right now, happening at Royal Dutch Shell, Equinor, which was the old Statoil. And I don't think it's just lip service or greenwashing. I think that they are viewing an electrified world, which is a world where you certainly can have natural gas. Natural gas will be important, but that oil will be less important. We're still going to need oil, but it's not going to be as important unless. And there are so many things that come into play in so many possible scenarios. If we have a technological breakthrough, and the American companies are putting some money into capture and sequestration. Mm-hmm. And Occidental and Chevron have been investing money in carbon engineering, where you basically will be making fuels by recycling carbon out of the air. This sounds like science fiction. Or capturing carbon out of the air and then using that carbon to sink into oil fields. And this is going to be happening in a few years in West Texas, where you could conceivably, some people say that we could actually have carbon negative oil. Hard to believe, but you would be putting more carbon into the ground than you would be burning and emitting into the atmosphere by using the oil. So, since I've been on this beat for 14 years and I've seen incredibly radical changes, the foremost being fracking and the reversal, of our needs, of natural gas. Suddenly, within 2 or 3 years, we didn't have enough, and then suddenly we had an overabundance. That things can change rather quickly, and so I know enough not to predict what's going to happen, because I know that if I give you a firm prediction on where the industry is going and where the energy is going, I'll be wrong.
So Don Llewellyn has asked you here, will fracking eventually take over oil as an energy source? Is there a place in the marketplace for each? And how large are the reserves of each? So you half answered that in a way, Clifford, but if you were to be put on the spot as to which you think might dominate?
Well, there's going to be, fracking is going to be important. We're talking now in the mix of oil and gas, right?
Yeah.
So obviously, for natural gas, it's dominant. It's dominant in 2 ways. It's dominant in the dry gas fields, but it's also dominant with the associated gas that's coming out of the Permian Basin. So fracking and gas, that's the way to go. On the oil front, it is going to continue to be very, very important, but I think that offshore, Gulf of Mexico, will continue to be important. And you see that in other places, for instance, Guyana and perhaps Suriname.
Yeah.
And I think, Mike, you may be involved in that.
We are in Suriname, yeah.
Yes. There's a lot of oil there. I've been to Suriname. I've been out in the field with ExxonMobil, 100 miles offshore, and they just keep finding more oil. And so there's offshore oil that could be very, very important. The political situation is not great in those countries, but yeah, most of the problem is above ground, not below ground.
Do you see that though as the last frontier big new oil basin, Clifford? Because there's a timing issue brewing here. When we discover in exotic places oil or gas, unless you can come up with a new concept that develops it quickly within a 5-year period, 10-year period, maybe for gas, you're heading towards a time where your investability may be trickier. So there's quite a big question for overall frontier oil and gas exploration around the world, which is different from the US fracking game completely, as you know. Right. What do you think?
Well, the frontier was going to be the Arctic. And that really looked like that's where it was going. Royal Dutch Shell had a huge project offshore Alaska, and there was a lot of interest in the Arctic, and I would imagine there's a lot of oil and gas up there, but price is the issue, and I don't think the price signal is right for Arctic oil and gas, except perhaps in Russia, and so that would be the next frontier if you had a much higher oil price. And of course, there are environmental issues. If we're going to peak demand in oil due to electrification and greater efficiency, then we probably have enough oil that's been discovered that we can exploit from the fracking, and people on this call know that you only get a fraction of the oil out of the field. And so with technology, you can get a lot more. If you want to find oil, go where oil's already been found, right? That's more or less the thing in the industry. So I don't know if there's going to be another next frontier. But again, people will be looking.
Got it. Thank you. And then the last one, which is a totally different subject to end with, we've got to do quickly, but is another one that could spend forever. Martha Carlson's asked about the Aramco attack, September 2019's terrorist attack, and the concerns globally for terrorist cyber attacks, refineries, which I think is the last thing remaining that could add to the current crisis, apart from pandemic, energy crisis, drop fuels. Could the world hit a different type of cyber and security issue that completely paralyzes us? It's not a nice thought, but what's your thoughts on that?
No, it's scary. I mean, everybody who's looked at the cyber issue, and we're all, just as consumers, we're all, vaguely concerned, at least vaguely concerned with the idea of identity theft and all of that. But the idea that we could be attacked by country or a terrorist group, and they could knock out, refinery or war, and how we retaliate, that is an enormous issue. It is an enormous issue, and not enough public conversation is going on. I am sure it's studied at the highest levels of government, but this is serious, for sure.
Yeah, and I think you've identified, I want you to end on an optimistic note, Clifford. I want you to give us a final optimistic note, because if one was to look at fragility around the world, from terrorism to the energy crisis to the pandemic, I think you've seen enough and said, well, it could go either way. I want you to tell us it's going to go the right way. So give us your final word on how it will end up the right way.
We do like optimism.
Yeah,
thank you, Tim.
I mean, I'm old enough now. I mean, I was a kid during the Cuban Missile. And I remember having a conversation with a friend of mine, and he said he had to go. We were playing outside, and he said, I got to go and do my homework. And I said, why bother? Because I thought it was all going to end, or it could end. So, and so I've seen a lot of bad stuff in my lifetime. The Cold War, the Vietnam War. I've seen a lot of, recessions, the 2008, 2009 crisis. And somehow we muddle through it. And so I don't usually get up in the morning thinking that the world is coming to an end. I don't think the world is coming to the end. And I certainly don't think that the coronavirus is gonna do it. Just one last thing, and that is that if you look at the history of pandemics, they have been profound, okay?
Yeah.
Byzantine Empire, Roman Empire, Black Plague, basically destroyed, feudalism in Western Europe, profound. But with modern medicine, this will not be as profound as that. And it's a terrible thing, and people are dying, and people are suffering, and there's an economic crisis.
Sure.
We got through World War II. We'll get through this.
A great way to end. Thank you, Clifford, from me. It's been a great pleasure. And thank you to the World Affairs Council, Jim, and the team and your sponsors.
Of course. Well, thank you both. And Cliff, I'm glad we have your good reporting to help dissect all of this. We really appreciate it. And Mike, I can't think of a better person to lead the conversation today. I want to wish everybody a very safe and happy weekend. Gentlemen, again, thanks so much for being with us. And to you, our viewers, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you.